Lieutenant Paul Boesch was a former professional wrestler from Texas who went into the Hürtgen forest as an infantry officer and came out one of the few men able to write down in unflinching detail what the place had actually been. He titled the account of it, when he wrote it, Road to Huertgen, Forest in Hell, and hell is the right word, because of all the ways a man could die in those woods. The one Boesch and the men around him remembered with the deepest dread was the one that fell from directly above their heads. A soldier in a shallow foxhole would hear a sound, and every muscle in him would know it was wrong. It was not the whistle of a shell coming in low. It was a series of sharp cracks overhead, in the treetops, followed by a rain of something that was not rain: wood, steel, bark, splinters the length of a man's forearm, driven down into the earth with the force of a hammer. A soldier's instinct, the thing every man was trained to do, was to press himself flat into the bottom of his hole, and that was the mistake. Because in this forest, lying flat did not save a man, it exposed him. The German gunners had learned to set their shell fuses to burst not on the ground, but in the canopy, 40 or 50 feet up, so that the blast came down from above, into the open tops of the foxholes, into the backs and shoulders and skulls of the men who thought the earth would protect them. The soldiers who survived learned to do the opposite of everything they had been taught. When the trees began to explode, they stood up. They pressed their bodies against the trunks and hugged the wood like a drowning man holds a piece of wreckage. Because a standing man tight against a tree caught fewer splinters than a man lying flat in an open hole. This was the Hürtgen forest, and the men who fought there, the American soldiers who walked into it in the autumn of 1944, would give it a name that has survived longer than most of the men who coined it. They called it the Death Factory. Not the death trap, not the killing ground, the factory. Because a factory is a place built for production, a place where the same process repeats, day after day, turning raw material into a finished product with mechanical indifference. And that is exactly what the Hürtgen forest did. It took healthy young men and it produced casualties, on a schedule, without pause, for months, and it did so with such regularity that the soldiers feeding into it stopped believing they would ever come out. Here is what should stop you cold about this story. The Hürtgen forest was not a beach that had to be stormed. It was not a bridge that had to be captured before the enemy blew it. It was not a city whose fall would end the war. It was a stretch of dense, wet, cold pine woods roughly 50 square miles in size, and for most of the battle, the American commanders who kept ordering men into it could not have told you, in a single clear sentence, why it needed to be taken at all. This is the part that has haunted historians for 80 years. The bloodiest forest battle in the history of the United States Army, the longest single battle the Army has ever fought, was waged over ground that many of the generals who ordered the attacks did not fully understand and, in the judgment of many who studied it afterward, did not need to fight for in the first place. If this story stays with you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, consider subscribing. To understand how tens of thousands of American soldiers ended up bleeding into the roots of these trees, you have to understand where the forest sat on the map, and what lay just beyond it. In September of 1944, the Allied armies were rolling east across France and Belgium at a speed that felt like the war might end by Christmas. Paris had fallen in August. The Germans were in retreat everywhere. And then, at the western border of Germany itself, the advance slammed into a wall. That wall was called the West Wall by the Germans and the Siegfried Line by the Americans, a belt of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, dragon's teeth tank obstacles, and minefields that ran along the frontier. Just behind that line sat the ancient German city of Aachen, the first major German city in the path of the American First Army. And south of Aachen lay the Hürtgen forest. The American plan, in its simplest form, was to reach the Rhine River, cross it, and drive into the German heartland. To do that, the First Army needed to push through this border region. And commanders looked at the dark mass of the Hürtgen on their maps and worried about it. They feared that if they bypassed the forest and pushed on toward the Rhine, German forces hidden inside those woods could burst out and strike the flank of the advancing army, in particular the southern flank of the drive on Aachen, so the decision was made to clear it, to go in and take the trees. Aachen itself must be understood, because it shaped everything the First Army was thinking in the autumn of 1944. This was the ancient imperial city of Charlemagne, the first great German city to lie in the path of the Western Allies, and it carried an enormous symbolic weight for the Germans, who were determined to hold the first city of the homeland to the last. The battle for Aachen was savage, a house-to-house, cellar-to-cellar fight that ground on into late October before the city finally fell to the Americans. Aachen was the first major German city captured by the Allies in the war, but the fighting there tied down American strength and attention, and it framed the Hürtgen in the minds of the commanders as a flank that had to be secured. The forest, in this thinking, was not an objective to be desired for itself. It was a threat to be neutralized so that the real advance could proceed. That framing, that the woods were a problem to be cleared rather than a place worth the price of taking, helps explain how the attacks kept going even as the cost climbed beyond all reason. What almost no one at the senior level grasped in those early weeks was that the real prize did not lie in the forest at all. It lay just beyond the far edge of it, on the Roer River, and on that river sat a set of dams. The Roer River dams, and in particular the great earthen dam called the Schwammenauel and the Urft Dam nearby, held back enormous reservoirs of water in the hills above the Roer Valley. Whoever controlled those dams controlled the river below them, and the river lay squarely across the path of any advance toward the Rhine. The logic was inescapable once it was seen clearly. If the Americans pushed across the Ruhr and drove east while the Germans still held the dams upstream, the enemy could open the discharge works or destroy them, sending the reservoirs down the valley in a surge that would raise the river into a raging barrier, cutting off and stranding any force caught on the far bank. An army does not cross a river with a loaded gun pointed at it from above. The dams were that gun. They were the key to the entire region, and until they were in American hands, no crossing of the Ruhr could be considered safe. And yet, for the crucial early phase of the fighting, in September and October of 1944, the American offensive was not aimed at the dams as its clear and central objective. The attacks were directed at the forest and its villages and road junctions, at clearing the woods, rather than at seizing the one set of structures that governed the whole campaign to come. Men were sent to fight through the trees for the trees' own sake, ridge by ridge and hamlet by hamlet, while the thing that actually controlled the battlefield sat almost unregarded behind them. Historians have pointed to this as the central failure of the entire affair, the failure to identify and fix upon the true objective from the start. It would take until December, after tens of thousands of casualties, for the dams to become the openly stated priority of the offensive. By then, the price had already been paid many times over, in a currency of men, for ground that need never have been the point. This is the mystery at the heart of the death factory. Not simply how so many men died, but why. Why an army that prized speed, maneuver, air power, and overwhelming firepower chose to fight, again and again, in the one kind of terrain where every single one of those advantages was stripped away. To understand that, we have to go into the trees, because the forest itself was a weapon, and it was a weapon that favored the defender so completely that the Germans, who were being beaten almost everywhere else in the autumn of 1944, found in the Hürtgen a place where they could bleed the American army white. Picture the ground. The Hürtgen was not a wild, natural woodland. It was in large part a planted forest, tall conifers set in dense, regular rows, their branches interlocking so tightly overhead that in places the floor of the forest lay in permanent green twilight, even at midday. A man could see only a few dozen yards in any direction. The ground beneath was cut by steep ridges and deep, sharp gorges, the most infamous of which was the gorge of the Kahl River, a plunging ravine crossed by a single narrow trail. Roads were few. The ones that existed were often little more than muddy firebreaks and logging tracks, too narrow and too soft to carry the weight of the war. And over all of it, for most of the battle, hung the weather. Cold rain that turned to sleet, then to snow. fog that clung to the trees and hid everything, mud so deep and so constant that it pulled the boots off men's feet. Now take everything the American army was good at, and watch the forest cancel it out one by one. American air power, which by late 1944 ruled the skies over the Western Front and could obliterate German columns in the open, was nearly useless here. The pilots could not see through the canopy and the fog to find targets, and the front lines were so tangled and close that bombing risked killing their own men. American tanks, the Sherman columns that had raced across France, could barely enter the forest at all. The trails were too narrow, the mud too deep, the ridges too steep. Where tanks did try to push forward, they were funneled onto single tracks, where a single German anti-tank gun or a hidden mine could stop an entire column, and a stopped column in that terrain was a line of steel coffins. American artillery, the great killer of the war, the arm in which the United States held a crushing advantage, was blunted too, because the forward observers who directed the guns could not see. Every tree looked like every other tree. There were no landmarks, no clear views, and no way to tell your own position from the enemy's 100 yards away. And then there was the way the forest turned the American artillery advantage back against its owners. The German gunners understood this ground. They had pre-registered their artillery, meaning they had calculated the exact settings needed to drop shells onto specific crossroads, clearings and trails, long before the Americans ever arrived. When American infantry moved through a killing zone, the Germans did not need to see them. They simply fired at coordinates they already knew by heart, and they used the trees. This is the tree burst, the signature horror of the Hürtgen. A normal artillery shell, fused to explode on contact with the ground, sends most of its lethal force outward and upward. A soldier lying flat in a foxhole is largely protected from it, but a shell fused to burst in the treetops explodes above the men and rains its fragments straight down, into the open holes, past the earthen walls that would have shielded a man from a ground burst. The forest canopy, which offered shade and concealment, became a ceiling that turned every artillery barrage into a downward storm of wood and steel. Men learned, as Boesch and every other survivor learned, that the old instinct to hug the ground would get them killed. The counterintuitive truth of the Hürtgen was that when the shells came, a man got up and held onto a tree and prayed. To this the Germans added the patient, methodical work of the defender who has had time to prepare. The bunkers and pillboxes of the west wall were built of thick reinforced concrete and sighted so that their fire crossed and overlapped, covering the few open lanes and fire breaks with interlocking streams of machine gun fire, so that a man stepping into a clearing stepped into the beaten zone of weapons he could not even see. Minefields were sown across the approaches and along the trails. Among them were small anti-personnel mines, some encased in wood so that the metal detectors of the day could not find them, and many designed to maim rather than to kill, because a wounded man is a heavier burden on an army than a dead one. A man killed is carried once. A man screaming with his foot blown off pulls his comrades to him, ties up litter bearers, fills the aid stations, and breaks the nerve of those who hear him. The Germans understood this cold logic and built their defenses around it. Barbed wire was strung through the underbrush where a man could not see it until he was in it, and the German infantry, though often outnumbered and increasingly made up of worn veterans, stiffened with hastily gathered replacements, was fighting now on the soil of its own homeland, in prepared positions, with the discipline and defensive craft that the Wehrmacht retained even in its long decline. The German command in the west understood the value of the ground perfectly and reinforced the sector to hold it. In the open country of France, the German army of late 1944 had been outflanked, outrun, and smashed by Allied mobility and air power. In the Hürtgen, it had found the one kind of battlefield where none of that could reach it, and where a small force of determined men in good positions could hold against many times their number and make the attacker pay in blood for every clearing, every trail junction, every 100 yards of trees. The 1st American Division to be fed into this machine in strength was the 9th Infantry Division, beginning in the middle of September of 1944. Its experience set the pattern that would repeat with terrible faithfulness, for the divisions that followed. The 9th pushed into the woods, aiming for the villages and road junctions that laced the forest, and it ran straight into everything the terrain and the defenders could deliver. Progress was measured in yards. A single clearing might change hands more than once. The fighting swirled around forest villages and clearings that the men came to know and dread. Casualties mounted at a rate that the ground gained could not begin to justify. The problem was not only the enemy in front, it was the impossibility of everything the modern army relied on to fight. Resupply had to come forward on foot or by hand cart along trails too narrow and too churned for trucks. Getting the wounded out to aid stations meant carrying them on litters back through the same fire that had cut them down, sometimes for hours, over ground where 4 men straining at the handles of a stretcher made a slow and easy target. Communications wire strung between units was cut by shell fire again and again, so that companies lost touch with their battalions and battalions with their regiments, and men found themselves fighting isolated actions with no clear idea what was happening a few hundred yards to either side. In the green gloom under the canopy, units became disoriented, lost direction, and in the worst cases fired on each other. The forest did not merely shelter the German defender, it blinded and choked and scattered the American attacker. Over weeks of grinding attacks, the 9th Infantry Division suffered thousands of casualties for an advance of only a few thousand yards. By one grim reckoning of that early fighting, the division took something close to 4,500 casualties to gain roughly 3,000 yards of forest. The arithmetic of the death factory was already visible. It was costing more than 1 American casualty for every yard of ground taken, and the forest was miles deep. That should have been the warning. It was, in the plainest terms the war could offer, a bill presented in advance for everything that was to follow, and it was not heeded. Here is where the story should have changed. A commander looking at the 9th Infantry Division's ordeal, at the fearful cost and the meagre gains, might have concluded that attacking straight through the heart of the forest was a mistake, and that the effort should be redirected, either around the woods or against the dams that actually mattered. But the attacks did not stop. Fresh divisions were brought up and sent in along the same axes, into the same terrain, against the same kind of defense. The forest kept producing, and in early November of 1944 came the episode that stands, even among the horrors of the Hürtgen, as the sharpest single tragedy of the battle. The destruction of the 28th Infantry Division at a village called Schmidt. The 28th was a Pennsylvania National Guard division, and it wore on its shoulder a red keystone patch. In the savage fighting to come, the Germans would give that red patch a grim nickname. They called it the Bloody Bucket. The division was commanded by a man whose name deserves to be remembered for reasons far larger than what happened in the forest, Major General Norman Cotter. On the morning of the D-Day landings in June of 1944, Cotter had been one of the senior officers on bloody Omaha Beach, and he had walked upright through the fire, rallying pinned and terrified men, and it was Cotter who was associated with one of the great lines of that day, urging the Rangers forward. He was, by any measure, a brave and capable soldier, and in November he was handed a plan for the Hürtgen that was flawed from the start. The objective was the village of Schmidt, which sat on high ground beyond the forest, near the approaches to the dams. To reach it, the 28th Division's regiments had to attack outward along diverging directions from the forest, so that instead of concentrating their strength, the assaulting units drove apart from one another, each isolated, each unable to easily support the others. The single most important supply route toward the forward positions ran down into and across the gorge of the Kahl River, along that narrow trail, and then up the far side. The Kahl Trail was the lifeline of the whole attack, and it was barely a road at all. It was a rough track clinging to the side of a steep, wooded ravine, and whether tanks could even use it to reach the exposed infantry at the front was a question that had not been truly answered before the men were committed. At first, there was a flash of success. On the 2nd and 3rd of November, American infantry pushed forward and actually took the village of Schmidt. For a moment it looked as though the plan might work, but the men who held Schmidt were at the far end of that impossible supply line, exposed on open ground beyond the trees, with the Karl Gorge at their backs, and their heavy support unable to reach them in strength. The Germans, under the overall command in this theatre of one of Hitler's most capable field marshals, Walter Model, reacted with speed and fury. German tanks and infantry counterattacked the thinly held village. The American infantry in Schmidt, lacking anti-tank guns in sufficient numbers, and without the armor support that could not get across the Karl, were driven out. The retreat from Schmidt turned, in places, into a rout. Men fell back in disorder toward the gorge, and the Karl Trail became a nightmare that has few equals in the American experience of the war. Engineers and tank crews fought to get Sherman tanks down the narrow track to support the infantry clinging to the ground beyond the gorge. In the darkness and the mud, on a trail with a rock wall on one side and a sheer drop on the other, tanks threw their tracks, slid, and in cases toppled off the trail entirely, blocking it for those behind. The single lifeline of the offensive became choked with wreckage, so that the armor the men so desperately needed on the far side could not reach them in the strength required. Engineers labored under fire to clear the track and keep it open, and the trail changed character by the hour, at times a supply route, at times a no-man's land, at times a corridor of the dead. Up on the exposed ground near the hamlet of Kommerscheid, the American infantry and the handful of tanks that had managed the crossing tried to hold against German armor that came on in strength, and were slowly overwhelmed and forced back. And in the village of Vossenack, on the ridge above the gorge, the fighting reached a pitch of horror that broke men outright. Vossenack, and especially the fight around its battered stone church, became a byword for the kind of close, grinding, back-and-forth slaughter that the forest specialized in. The village changed hands in vicious close combat. Elements of the American force there, pounded without relief by artillery, cut off, exhausted beyond the limits of endurance, and gave way in places in a manner that the official histories record with unusual frankness, because the human breaking point had simply been reached. Engineers and infantry fought to retake and hold the ruined village and its church, and the ground around Vossenack was contested at a cost that beggars description for a place most Americans have never heard of. In roughly 2 weeks of this, the 28th Infantry Division was effectively wrecked as a fighting force. It suffered more than 6,000 casualties. Some of its rifle companies were reduced to a handful of survivors, a fraction of the men who had gone in. It was one of the most costly single-division actions the United States Army endured in the entire war in Europe, and it had been paid for in a corner of a forest, for objectives that control of the dams could have rendered meaningless. General Cotter, the hero of Omaha Beach, watched his division be destroyed in an attack whose plan had been shaped by higher command and by the merciless ground, and the memory of the Hürtgen sat heavily on many who had ordered it and survived it. But out of the horror of the Karl Gorge came one of the few episodes of the entire battle that speaks to something other than waste and slaughter. Down in that ravine, amid the wreckage and the dying, there was a moment of mercy, and it is a true story, carefully documented. In the aftermath of the fighting along the Karl, wounded American soldiers lay in the gorge, many of them unable to move, caught between the lines where no organized aid could easily reach them. A German medical officer, a doctor named Günther Hürtgen, was working in the area tending to casualties. Over a period of days around the height of the crisis, an informal, local truce took hold along the Karl Trail. The guns in that immediate place fell silent long enough for the wounded to be treated and moved. German and American medical personnel, in the middle of one of the worst battles of the war, allowed the collection and care of injured men. Dr. Hürtgen worked to see that wounded soldiers on both sides received aid. It did not stop the larger battle. It saved no strategy and changed no map. But for the men whose lives were spared in that gorge, it was everything. Decades later, a memorial would stand near the Karl Trail to mark what happened there, a reminder that even in the death factory, the thread of common humanity was not entirely severed. That thread matters because it is easy, when the numbers grow this large, to lose the individual human being inside them. The Hürtgen was not one story, it was tens of thousands of stories, most of them never told, ended in an instant by a tree burst or a machine gun, or a mine, the men who carried them dead before they could become the fathers and grandfathers who might have spoken of it. But some of the men who passed through those woods left records that let us see the forest through their eyes, and 2 of them would go on to become among the most famous writers of their century. One of them was a young staff sergeant in the 4th Infantry Division named Jerome David Salinger. The world would come to know him as J.D. Salinger, the author of a novel about a boy named Holden Caulfield that became one of the most widely read books in the English language. But in the autumn of 1944, he was a soldier attached to an infantry regiment, doing counterintelligence work, and he went into the Hürtgen forest with the 4th Division during the worst of its fighting there in November. He carried with him, it is said, the pages of the novel he was working on, the manuscript that would eventually become that famous book, written in snatches when the fighting allowed. The 4th Infantry Division was chewed to pieces in the Hürtgen, much as the others had been, suffering thousands of casualties in the same kind of grinding advance through the same lethal trees. Its regiments went in near full strength and came out as shadows. Salinger survived the forest, and he survived the rest of the war in Europe, but he did not come away untouched. Not long after the fighting ended in Europe, he was hospitalized for what the era called combat stress, the same breaking of the spirit that took so many in the woods. The things he witnessed in that autumn and the months that followed marked him for the rest of his long life. He is one of the great examples of the hidden cost of a battle like this, the cost that never appears in any casualty table, because the man walked out of the forest alive. What he walked out carrying, he carried in near total silence for the rest of his days. The other writer was not a soldier but a correspondent, and he was, by 1944, already one of the most famous authors alive. Ernest Hemingway had attached himself to the 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division, and he formed a deep bond with its commander, a colonel named Charles Lanham. Hemingway was present in the region during the forest fighting, and he wrote about it afterward with a bleakness that stands out even in his hard-eyed body of work. He compared the experience to the grinding slaughter of the First World War, to the kind of static, attritional killing that the Second World War was supposed to have left behind. The forest, in his telling, was a place where the war went backward, into the mud and the trenches and the meat grinder of an earlier age. That a writer who had seen as much war as Hemingway reached for the imagery of the worst of the previous war to describe the Hürtgen tells you something about what the place was. Because that is the deeper truth beneath the tactical story. The Hürtgen was a battle that belonged, in its character, to a war that was supposed to be over. The Second World War in the West was, for the Allies, a war of movement, of tanks and aircraft and sweeping advances. The Hürtgen dragged the American army back into the world of 1916, into the world of Verdun and Passchendaele, where men fought and died by the thousand over a few hundred yards of ruined ground, where the terrain and the weather and the guns mattered more than any brilliant maneuver, where the only tactic left was to keep feeding bodies into the line until something gave. This was the anachronism at the heart of the death factory. The most modern and mechanized army in the world had been drawn onto ground where its modernity meant nothing, and forced to fight the kind of battle it had been built to avoid. And still the attacks went on. Through November and into December, fresh divisions were committed. The 4th Infantry Division, the same Ivy Division that Hemingway rode with, sent its regiments into the trees in the middle of November, and the cost was staggering. One of its regiments, the 22nd Infantry, went into the forest with something over 3,000 men, and in about 2.5 weeks of fighting, lost the great majority of them, a casualty toll that ran to roughly 85% of its strength, for an advance measured in a few thousand yards of woods and a single shattered village. Within days, the regiment lost all 3 of its battalion commanders. The 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red one, fought in the forest and on the approaches around it, and it ended its ordeal in a grim action near the villages of Langerwehe and Merode, where 2 American companies pushed into a village at the forest's edge and were cut off and destroyed by German counterattack, with the men who had gone in never coming out. The 8th Division, the 9th, elements of others, all took their turn in the trees. Villages with names that meant nothing to the men before they arrived, and everything to them afterward, were taken and lost and taken again. And there was one particular piece of high ground that came to stand for the whole struggle. A hill, known on the maps by its height in meters, Hill 400. Hill 400 rose above the forest near the town of Bergstein, and because it was high ground that commanded a view over the surrounding country toward the Ruhr, it was a prize both sides understood, and neither would willingly give up. In early December of 1944, the task of taking it fell to one of the most elite units in the American Army, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, men of the same lineage who had scaled the cliffs of Pont de Hoc under fire on the morning of D-Day. On the morning of December 7, 1944, the Rangers went at the hill. They came out of their positions and charged up the slope, and the story of that assault has become part of the lore of the American infantry, the Rangers going up the hill with such ferocity and such noise that they carried the summit in a short, violent, close-quarters fight. And then came the harder part, which was to hold what they had taken. Among the men on that summit was Sergeant Leonard Lommel, who 6 months earlier had been one of the Rangers who scaled the cliffs at Pont du Hoc on D-Day and helped destroy the German guns there, and who now found himself in another desperate fight on another piece of impossible ground. The Germans wanted the hill back and could not afford to lose it, and they brought down on that bare summit an artillery fire of terrible intensity, for they had the height registered to the meter as they had registered everything else in that forest. The Rangers dug in on ground so hard and so raked with fire that digging was nearly impossible, and they endured counterattack after counterattack from German infantry determined to push them off. Their numbers dwindled through a day and a night and beyond, the little force on the summit growing smaller with each barrage and each assault, holding on when by every reasonable measure they should have been overrun and destroyed. Lommel himself was badly wounded there. They held until they were at last relieved, and the cost among that small band was fearful. The great majority of the men who took the hill killed or wounded in the holding of it. Their stand on Hill 400 became one of the legendary small unit actions of the entire war, a distilled example of the courage the American soldier carried into the Hürtgen, courage that the battle so often spent for so little. And there was the village that gave the whole forest its name. Hürtgen itself, a small cluster of stone buildings deep in the woods, had to be taken as the battleground on, and the task fell in large part to the 8th Infantry Division, which relieved the shattered 28th in that sector and took up the same terrible work. The 8th pushed toward Hürtgen village through the same trees, the same mines, the same pre-registered artillery that had broken the divisions before it, and it took its own heavy toll of casualties in doing so. The village was finally cleared in the latter part of November, in fighting that once again cost far more than the size of the objective could ever explain. To look at Hürtgen village on a map is to see a handful of buildings in the woods. To read what it cost to take is to understand what the whole battle was, a place where small objectives consumed large numbers of men, over and over, until the forest was full of the dead. It is worth pausing on the men holding the other side of that line, because the American soldier in the Hürtgen was not fighting an enemy in collapse. The overall German commander in the West, during much of this period, was Field Marshal Walter Model, a hard, driving general whom Hitler trusted to stabilize crumbling fronts, a man with a gift for improvised defense who threw himself into holding the border. Under his direction, the Germans fed unit after unit into the forest to hold it, understanding as well as anyone what the ground was worth to a defender. They fought from prepared positions with skill and stubbornness. They counterattacked at the moments the Americans were most exposed, and they made the Americans buy every clearing at a brutal exchange rate. This is part of why the Hürtgen ground on so long and cost so much. It was not a walkover delayed by bad luck. It was a hard fight against a capable enemy on the enemy's chosen ground, and the Germans, though they too bled heavily and could not win the war in those woods, achieved exactly what a defender in such terrain sets out to achieve. They traded ground slowly. They inflicted casualties out of all proportion to their own strength, and they held for months a position that on any open field they could not have held for days. Courage was never what the American soldier in the Hürtgen lacked. That is one of the things that makes the battle so painful to study. The men did everything that was asked of them, and more. The forest produced acts of individual heroism so extraordinary that the nation's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor, was earned in those woods by soldier after soldier, and in most cases, the deeds that earned it were not glorious charges, but desperate, selfless acts to save the men beside them, or to break a defense that was killing their comrades. Several of these men did not live to receive the medal. Their courage was recognized only after they were gone. There was First Lieutenant Bernard Ray of the 8th Infantry Regiment, part of the 4th Infantry Division, who on November 17, 1944, faced a barrier of German barbed wire that was holding up his men under heavy fire. To blow a gap through the wire so his soldiers could advance, he prepared explosives, and while he was doing so, he was badly wounded. Understanding that he was dying and determined that the charge would still open the way for his men, he completed the work of setting off the explosives in his final moments, and the detonation that opened the gap for the attack cost him his life. He was awarded the Medal of Honor after his death. There was Staff Sergeant John Minnick, who during the fighting in that sector pressed forward against the enemy with tremendous aggression, moving alone against positions that were holding up his unit, killing and capturing the men in them and breaking open the defense, until he advanced into a minefield and was killed. His courage cleared the way for the soldiers who came behind him. He too received the medal after his death. There was Sergeant Jonah Kelly, whose Medal of Honor action came in the bitter fighting near the village of Kestenich early in 1945, close to the same ground and the same campaign for the approaches to the Ruhr. Grievously wounded, he led his men through savage house-to-house combat, working his rifle with one hand when the other could no longer serve him, refusing to leave his soldiers, and he was killed while leading them forward. There were others across this fighting whose names are recorded in the citations, men who silenced machine gun nests, who led attacks after every officer had fallen, who stayed behind to cover the withdrawal of the wounded, who did the specific, terrible, necessary things that the flat official language of a citation can only gesture at. More than a dozen men earned the Medal of Honor in the fighting for the forest and the ground immediately around it, a great many of them posthumously, the award reaching only their families. Behind them stand thousands of others, whose courage was equal and whose deeds were seen by no one who survived to report them. That is the cruelest arithmetic of a battle like this. The valor that is recorded is only the valor that had a witness. In the Hürtgen, countless acts of bravery died with the men who performed them and the men who might have told of them, buried together under the same trees. By the middle of December of 1944, the battle for the Hürtgen had been grinding on for 3 months, and the wider war was about to lurch violently in a new direction. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its great surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest to the south, the attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The eyes of the world, and of the High Command, swung toward that crisis. The Hürtgen fighting, which had already consumed so much, was suddenly overshadowed by the drama unfolding in the snow of Belgium. This is a large part of why the Hürtgen is so little remembered today compared to the Bulge or to D-Day. It was long, it was grim, it produced no clean victory and no famous turning point, and then it was swallowed in the public memory by the more dramatic battle that came right after it. The men who fought in the forest came home to find that the country barely knew the name of the place that had nearly killed them. But the grim irony of the Hürtgen was not yet complete, because when the fighting in and around the forest finally reached its conclusion in February of 1945, the objective that had mattered most all along, the objective that had sat behind the trees the entire time, came due. The Ruhr River dams. By now, the American command understood clearly what it had perhaps understood too late, that the dams controlled the river and the river controlled the advance to the Rhine. In February of 1945, American forces, including the 78th Infantry Division and paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, drove at last to seize the dams. As they pushed through the Karl Gorge in that final phase, the men moving up the trail came upon the dead of the previous November, the fallen of the 28th Division who had never been recovered. lying where they had died through the winter, preserved by the cold. It was a passage through the frozen evidence of everything the battle had cost, and here the forest delivered its final, bitter lesson. As the Americans closed in on the great Schwammenauer Dam, the Germans destroyed the discharge valves and machinery, deliberately wrecking the dam's control works so that the reservoir drained not in a single dramatic flood, but as a sustained, swollen surge that raised the Ruhr River and turned its valley into an impassable barrier of high, fast, freezing water. The Americans captured the dams, but the Germans, by sabotaging them at the last moment, achieved their real aim. The flooding of the Ruhr Valley delayed the American crossing of the river for roughly 2 weeks. Think carefully about what that means, alongside everything that came before. The dams were the thing that had truly mattered from the beginning, and when the battle for them and for the forest that guarded them was finally resolved, the enemy still managed to use them, in destruction, to buy the delay he wanted. The prize that could have been the focus from the start had instead been reached at the end, after the death factory had already run for months and consumed the strength of division after division. Now come the numbers, and they must be spoken plainly, because they are the reason this battle earned its name. The precise American casualty total for the Hürtgen has been debated by historians for decades, in part because the battle's boundaries in time and space are not perfectly fixed, and different accountings include different units and different weeks. But the most commonly cited figure for total American casualties in the Hürtgen forest fighting is around 33,000 men. Some careful studies, taking a broader accounting of the campaign and including the full toll of the sick and the injured alongside the killed and wounded, place the number considerably higher, in the range of 50,000 or more. What is not in dispute is the scale. Tens of thousands of American soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or broken in that forest. German losses were also severe, with estimates commonly around 28,000, and a crucial part of the American total was not caused by bullets or shells at all. The forest killed and disabled men through the weather and the conditions as surely as through combat. The autumn of 1944 in that country was cold and sodden, a season of relentless rain that turned to sleet and then to snow, and the men lived in it without shelter, in holes dug into the freezing ground, often with water standing in the bottom. Out of this came an epidemic of what the soldiers called trench foot, the same affliction that had crippled the armies of the First World War a generation before. When feet are kept too long in cold and wet, the flesh begins to die. The feet swell and go numb, and turn a dark, mottled color, and in the worst cases the tissue rots, and a man who cannot feel his feet cannot walk on them, and toes and even whole feet were lost. Trench foot alone took thousands of men out of the line, soldiers who had not been touched by a single German bullet, but who could no longer stand. Respiratory illness swept through the freezing foxholes. Frostbite took its share. And there was the wound that the medical tables of the time called combat exhaustion, and that we would now understand as the mind's collapse under a strain no mind was built to bear. Imagine days and nights without end under the tree bursts, the ground heaving, the splinters raining down, the men beside you killed one after another, no sleep, no dry ground, no sense that any of it would ever stop or mean anything. Under that, men broke. They wept, they froze, they lost the ability to function, and they had to be led or carried to the rear like the physically wounded, because in a real sense that is what they were. In the Hürtgen, these non-battle casualties ran extraordinarily high, and in some units they rivaled or even exceeded the losses to enemy fire. The factory did not care how it produced its casualties, shell fragment or frozen foot, or the simple, final wearing away of a human being's capacity to endure. It took them all the same, and it counted them all the same, and it never once slowed down. So we return to the question at the center of this story, the question that has kept historians arguing for 80 years. Why? Why was this battle fought at all, and why in this way? The judgment of many of the most serious students of the Hürtgen has been severe, and it carries special weight because some of those students were there. Charles MacDonald was a young infantry company commander in that fighting before he became one of the most respected historians of the American Army in the Second World War. the author of the official histories of the campaign. A man who had led soldiers in those woods and then spent a career studying the records, came to describe the Hürtgen as a battle of dubious necessity, fought at a cost wildly out of proportion to anything it achieved, and he was far from alone. The historians who have examined the Hürtgen in the decades since have returned again and again to the same hard conclusions. They point to it as one of the clearest cases in the entire American war effort of a battle that need not have been fought in the way it was. They describe an offensive kept alive by its own momentum, by a reluctance at the higher levels of command to stop and admit that the whole approach was mistaken, by the sunk cost of the blood already spilled, which made it feel impossible to turn back, even as turning back was exactly what reason demanded. Feed one more division in, the thinking seemed to run, and the line will break, and then the previous losses will not have been in vain. But the line did not break on those terms. The forest simply consumed the next division as it had consumed the last. It has been called a battle that was lost before it began, and a defeat in every sense but the technical one, since the ground was, in the end, taken. The taking of it settled nothing that could not have been settled at the dams, and the dams could have been the object from the first week rather than the last. The specific failures can be named without malice, because naming them is the only way the deaths acquire meaning. There was the failure, already described, to fix upon the dams rather than the trees as the true objective in those early weeks. There was the choice to attack directly into terrain that stripped away every American advantage, when the forest might in places have been contained or bypassed. There was the repetition, the sending of fresh divisions along the same axes into the same defenses that had already destroyed the divisions before them, in the belief that one more push would break through. And there was the plan at Schmidt, with its diverging attacks and its single impossible supply line down the Kal Gorge, a plan that asked brave men to do what the ground would not allow. None of this is to say the German defense was anything other than skilled and determined, or that the American soldier was anything other than magnificent in his courage and endurance. Both of those things are true, and they make the waste more painful, not less. The tragedy of the death factory is precisely that so much valor and so much sacrifice were poured into a battle whose necessity so many later came to doubt. The men did not fail. They were failed by the concept that sent them in, and yet the meaning we take from the Hürtgen does not have to end in bitterness, because the men themselves did not fight for the strategy, they fought for each other. This is the truth that runs underneath every account written by those who were there. In the freezing dark of those foxholes, with the trees exploding overhead and the wounded crying out in the gorge, the soldier did not endure, because he understood or agreed with the plan that had brought him to that place. Most of them did not. He endured because the man in the next hole was depending on him, and because he could not bring himself to fail the men beside him. Lieutenant Ray finished setting off the charge that killed him, so that his soldiers could advance. The medics went down into the Kal Gorge under the guns. The Rangers held the top of Hill 400 through the shelling because their comrades were holding it with them. The bond between soldiers, the refusal to let each other down, was the one thing in that forest that the terrain could not defeat and the enemy could not kill. That is the enduring lesson buried in the roots of the Hürtgen, and it is a harder and more honest lesson than the ones we usually take from the great victories. It is easy to find meaning in a triumph. It is far harder to find it in a battle that many believe should never have been fought the way it was. But the meaning is there, and it does not live in the maps or the objectives or the arguments of the generals. It lives in the men. In their willingness to go into a place they called the death factory, day after day, for months, not because they believed it would win the war in a stroke, but because they had been ordered to, and because their friends were going with them. That kind of endurance, offered up in a battle that did not deserve it, is in some ways a purer form of courage than the kind that is rewarded with a clear victory. It asks everything and promises nothing. The Hürtgen forest is quiet now. The trees have grown back over the ridges and the gorges. The Karl Trail still winds down into its ravine, and the memorial near it still marks the place where, for a few days in the middle of a slaughter, enemies agreed to save each other's wounded. Visitors who walk those woods today find them beautiful, green and still, and it is almost impossible to imagine what happened there. But the ground remembers. Fragments of steel still work their way up out of the soil, and the names remain, in the citations and the cemeteries and the casualty lists, the record of tens of thousands of young men who walked into those trees in the autumn and winter of 1944. They came from every corner of a distant country, farm boys and city clerks, factory hands and college students, men like Paul Boesch, the wrestler from Texas, who pressed himself against a tree trunk as the canopy exploded above him and lived to write down what it was. Most of them had never heard the name Hürtgen before they were sent into it. Many of them never spoke it again once they came out, because some things are carried in silence. But they were there. They held the line, and they climbed the hills, and they carried the wounded, and they did what the men beside them needed them to do. And now you know the name of the forest they fought in, and the price they paid in it, and the reason their story deserves to be remembered even though, and perhaps especially because, the battle itself should never have had to be fought. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, the best way to help it find others who care about this history is a like and a comment. If you are not yet subscribed, this is a good moment. I would like to know where you are watching from today. And if someone in your own family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a name spoken quietly at the dinner table when you were young, tell me about them below. Most of those men said very little about what they saw. Remembering them here is one way we make sure that what they carried is not forgotten.